relationship to the amount of oxygen and the charges on the oxygen. So it's not a receptor that binds oxygen or doesn't bind it, but it responds to changes in PO2. So in the aortic arch or in the carotid sinuses, when there is low PO2, so we're not talking about hemoglobin saturation, but decreased amounts of oxygen in the plasma, potassium channels close. So potassium normally leaves a cell or comes into a cell?
Comes in.
Where is it in its highest concentration? Inside a cell or outside a cell?
Outside.
Potassium. Potassium's highest concentration is inside the cell. I know, we've been doing this for months and your brain's tired of hearing it. Potassium concentration is higher inside a cell. So when we close potassium channels, this is kind of like the photon receptors in the eye. When we close potassium channels, potassium stays inside the cell. So the cell becomes more positive. When the cell becomes more positive, calcium channels open. Okay, so it's back to those ion channels again. When the calcium enters, remember the synaptotagment of our synaptic bulbs? All right, so when calcium comes in a similar process, these vesicles containing dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter, open. That neurotransmitter binds to sensory neurons of either the vagus nerve or the glossopharyngeal nerve, all right, and fire signals to the dorsal respiratory group. It's a cool little oxygen kind of sensor. So the glomus cell, when low oxygen is not in the area, changes the potassium channels, closes them, positive ions increase instead of getting an action potential. That's how we get the calcium channels to open, is increased positive ions because potassium channels are closed. With increased calcium, we have a change in the membrane integrity, and it is able to bind with the external membrane, releasing these dopamine-containing vesicles. So the dopamine is synthesized by the glomus. Okay, it's kind of like our replacement of our preganglionic neuron, and then that causes either glossopharyngeal or vagus to fire. The hydrogen ions have a similar effect, but more directly. Why would the hydrogen ions have a similar effect? We build up positive ions on the outside of a cell. Positive ions on the inside of the cell are less likely to leave. So we have an increase in positive ions inside the cell. Same effect, our calcium channels open. So, guys don't have to memorize this slide. When you get to respiratory, if you're taking a respiratory program, or if you get to the respiratory center, if you're taking nursing, you'll get into this a little bit more detail. But here, this is the key factor here. Oxygen typically as a drive to breathe. So hypoxic hypoxia is what we're seeing here. It typically only becomes a drive to breathe when the PO2 drops below 60 millimeters of mercury. Okay. Then it will do what we just saw. Hydrogen ions will have an effect higher than that, okay, on our peripheral PO2. Now, with emphysema, I don't want to take away your component here, but listen carefully to the discussion of PO2 and the drive to breathe with emphysema, because things start to change. And you have a respiratory condition which has a chronically high levels of PCO2. So typically what changes, so when we exercise, all right, typically what changes, we're producing more CO2. Just the stretching, before you even really exercise, starting to move your joints will change your respiratory rate in response to proprioceptive stimuli. As you then get into your exercise, increased hydrogen ions will not affect the central nervous system, but will affect the peripheral nervous system. Okay? Increased PCO2 as the cells are actively making ATP and releasing carbon dioxide. Increased CO2 is going to primarily affect the CNS chemoreceptors via the cerebral spinal fluid forming hydrogen ions and increase your respiration. So we end up using both. One from hydrogen ions produced by carbonic acid and the other from hydrogen ions produced by carbonic acid in the CSF. All right, we'll stop there. We're done. No more new material.